Welcome to Practicing Failure, where we learn about mental health, celebrate mistakes, and explore how failure helps us grow. I'm your host, Dr. Amanda Castle. I'm really excited to introduce my guest today, Dr. Heather Clinkenbeard. Dr. Clinkenbeard is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in helping people navigate the messy realities of compulsive sexual behavior, infidelity, professional impairment, and relational wounding. With advanced training from one of the nation's leading treatment centers for sex addiction, she brings both expertise and a refreshingly honest and compassionate voice to the work of healing. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited. We're going to have a good conversation today. I know compulsive sexual behavior is a difficult topic. It elicits very strong reactions from people in all directions. And so we're going to unpack this topic within the context of relational attachment. And the short version of that is just kind of describing how we relate to other people, how we connect to them. And we're also going to talk about relational ruptures that can result from broken trust, such as infidelity, and then what repair and healing looks like in relationships. Sound good?
Great. Yeah, I love it.
So the first thing we're going to do is just kind of define our terms. So can you explain to us, what is compulsive sexual behavior?
Yeah, it's a great place to start, actually, when we think about just the way that, like, even the idea of like, oh, sex addiction or compulsive sexual behavior, it still is so often like the punchline of a joke, or it's so misunderstood in media and people who are caught cheating. And so I'm glad that we're actually defining it, because I think it's really important to understand really what it is. And, I've had people say like, oh, what? You can't be addicted to sex. I mean, sex feels good. It's such a good thing. Mm-hmm. But really, it isn't actually about that sex feels good. And for most people who are struggling with compulsive sexual behavior, they'll tell you that they don't find pleasure out of it anymore. They're kind of stuck in this cycle. And it really becomes this pattern of kind of repetitive, intense sexual impulses and urges and behavior. There's often impairment in their personal life, their relationships, their jobs. I mean, I've had people who will act out at work and then they get fired because they've used devices that belong to the company. And that's not, they didn't find pleasure out of that. It's just they were compelled to do it. And usually there are unsuccessful attempts at trying to stop or kind of curb the sexual urges and behavior, and they're unsuccessful. And a lot of times they'll say, oh, I will never do this. Like, I'm never going to masturbate at work. And then they do. So there's this escalation, this tolerance that happens. And they really, underneath so much of it, is they're using sex as a way to cope with uncomfortable emotions, discomfort, shame, loneliness, boredom. And it just becomes this automatic go-to, and they're stuck in this cycle. And very similar to other addictions.
That's what I was just going to say. It reminds me of how other addictions work, where they're not always necessarily a bad thing, like compulsive eating. Mm-hmm. We all have to eat. We all enjoy food. And sometimes we all overeat, and that's very different than the act of compulsive eating.
Yes.
And the line for that is then subjective to each person who's dealing with it, as with any addiction.
Yes. One of the things that, I think family members might find frustrating is kind of that question of like, do you find this distressing? Is it causing problems to you? And if the answer is no, there's really not a lot of room to go from there. It might be distressing to your family members, and they might be seeing things that you're not, but it is subjective in that way.
Yeah, that's a different conversation of this thing that I don't find distress around upsets my family. Mm-hmm. That's a conversation a lot of families have to have in different arenas.
Yes.
So what do you feel like makes compulsive sexual behavior maybe different from other compulsive behaviors?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the biggest part is actually the relational component. When we think about somebody who is drinking too much, it doesn't feel as personal as, say, your partner who is cheating on you, is sexting with somebody that you didn't even know they were sexting. That feels so much more personal. Um, and it feels like it says something about me as a partner that you would kind of betray me in this way. Whereas alcohol, like that kind of feels like, well, that's a you problem. Um, and so that really is one of I think the bigger differences. The other, and kind of along with the food, we have to eat.
We
We
have to
are,
eat. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we are sexual beings. Sex is a part of being human. We could literally go the rest of our lives and never have a drink or take a drug. But to say you can't ever eat again or you can't ever be sexual again doesn't align with being human. And so I think that part also that makes it really different.
It's a lot more complicated then.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And as we talk about things, we're going to be talking about kind of in relationships. And I want to acknowledge that some people are in various types of relationship structures.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you see this, or how does it look different in, say, the poly community or in the LGBTQ community?
Yeah. If I were working with somebody and they identified in the community, I really would be asking the question back to, is this distressing to you? Is it causing problems in your relationship? And that's one thing, I really caution people when, if they are kind of questioning, gosh, is this behavior unhealthy? Is it hurting me? To really find a provider who is open to the community, who is affirming. Because what I might for myself say, no, I would never engage in X, Y, and Z behavior might actually be very acceptable and healthy for somebody else. The spectrum of sexual behavior and relationships, it is so vast, and
So
it
vast.
isn't, yeah, and it isn't up to me to decide what is kind of right or wrong. It's really helping you decide, does this align with you and your values and who you want to be and how you live your life? And if it isn't, okay, let's help you figure out why. And how do we help you get to where you feel more in alignment with yourself?
It very much focuses on sort of values driven from the client's perspective, what is in alignment with their values versus taking sort of a moral or ethical stance of right and wrong.
Yes.
That changes how we respond to the conversation, because then it's not just operating out of shame.
Yeah. And shame is such a huge part of this compulsive behavior. So many people, that's really what keeps them stuck, is that shame. And feeling like I'm alone in this and somebody's going to judge me for this. Somebody isn't going to understand this. And it often does keep them stuck in it.
And so then if we reinforce shame, it's not actually going to help the behavior.
Yes, exactly.
I feel like there's a lot of lessons we can take away from that in life, but we're going to stay focused.
Yeah.
Are there other common themes that you find coming up in your work, either with couples or with individuals that are dealing with this?
Yeah, shame is one of them. But really, I have a list. I think individuals that have grown up in really rigid or punitive households, especially where shame is shameful or even punished, I think that, like, the idea that you are bad if you get caught, Googling boobs, or they find out, oh my gosh, you masturbated, and you don't do that. That's so gross. That's icky. We don't do that in this family. I think that can be a huge huge burden because we are sexual beings, and we are from the moment we're born till the day we die.
And as we develop and grow, we're figuring it out. What does that mean? And what does it look like?
Yes. And we constantly are.
Yeah.
I mean, I have had an 80-year-old woman sitting in my office talking about, how do I have better conversations with my husband about sex? And she was 80 years old, and I loved it. And she was still figuring it out. But not all families are open to those conversations, and it's so sad. And kind of connected to that is then also sex never being talked about. We just ignore it. We pretend like it doesn't exist. We don't even acknowledge how babies are made, which is
They're not storks.
Crazy. Right?
I got to do some reading.
Yeah. I think the other one too is, a lot of people will come in and say, I don't know why I'm like this. Like, I had a great childhood, a perfect childhood. And yet when we dig a little deeper, what we often uncover is there usually is a lot of emotional neglect that is happening, a lot of misattunement, parents kind of unavailable to the needs of the child. And then this child finds this thing that, this feels good. It makes me feel less alone. I feel better. So that emotional neglect is so profound. And I consistently see that show up with the people that I work with.
When you say misattunement, can you kind of define that for us?
Yeah, it's the idea that because kids don't have always the language or the ability to communicate what they need, they're still learning, they're still figuring that out. And really it is the parent, the adults, the caregiver's job to be able to recognize it, identify it, name it with the child, and then provide whatever sort of support that child needs in whatever they're feeling, whatever that unmet need is, because the child doesn't know how to do that on their own. And when a parent misreads those cues or ignores those cues,
or says you're fine when they're crying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Or I'll give you something to cry about.
Ooh.
Yeah. It causes distress for that child. And those feelings have to go somewhere. The child is going to find, the body is going to find a way to cope with and process those feelings. And hopefully the parent can do it, but sometimes they don't.
Mm-hmm. And for all the parents out there, like, you will fail at different points.
Yes.
But if a critical mass is in the right direction and you know how to repair, which we'll get to as we go, that changes how failure is kind of managed. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely fair. I often like to tell parents, you only have to be a good enough parent. And I didn't make up this stat. It came from research. You only have to be a good enough parent 60% of the time. The rest is knowing how to repair. It is knowing how to show up and say, honey, I made a mistake there, and that must have hurt. I'm so sorry. 60% of the time, that's so doable.
That is much more doable than the expectations we tend to put on ourselves.
Yes. And perfect all the time.
All the time. Yes. And I have to tell parents too, there's the act of repair and how that affects the child. And then it is also, you are modeling how to repair in just the act of doing it.
Yes.
And showing that, like, apologies don't have to be shameful. Saying I got this wrong doesn't have to destroy your own ego and identity.
Yeah. It also gives the child permission to be imperfect. Oh, my caregiver made a mistake and they didn't die from it. Oh, it must be okay that I can make mistakes too, and I'm still lovable because I still love my caregiver even though they just made a mistake.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think so often we didn't learn that. We didn't learn that it was okay to make mistakes.
And then the shame comes in. Because if everybody else is not making mistakes, but I am, I must be bad, and there must be something fundamentally wrong with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then if we don't talk about it, it just makes that shame even worse.
What a lonely way to go through life.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It really is. I think just to kind of come back to the other thing that I see consistently is there are often really mixed messages about sex and our bodies. One of the ones, especially in religious communities, is sex is really bad. Don't be sexual. Don't acknowledge this part of you until you get married.
And then just turn it
all
on.
of us, totally. And that is such a confusing message. Well, also at the same time, media, the culture around us is telling us, oh, men, you get your worth, your power through sex, and sex sells. And, oh, but by the way, women, don't be too sexy, but be sexy enough. But if you are too much and you cause me a problem, that's your fault, not my fault. So it's this really confusing way to grow up. And then it leads to where people end up kind of performing sex as opposed to connecting through sex. And we're starting to actually see that younger and younger. I work with teachers and schools, administrators, and I have heard stories of, they'll confiscate the kids' phones and there's drama happening in the friend group, and they find out, oh, well, so-and-so recorded, these two people in a sex act, and these kids are literally mimicking what they're watching in porn. Instead of like learning, oh, maybe I like this boy and maybe I just want to kiss this person. No, instead they're moving on to full on sex acts because that's what they think they're supposed to be doing, which is really sad. I mean, even recently I think this past season in Law and Order SVU, there was an episode where I'm not going to get all the details right, but the kids were taught something by the parent and they thought that's how they were supposed to have sex. And then their friends learned that, and it ended up being that they were assaulting these girls, but they didn't know. They thought this is what sex is. So it really becomes complicated.
I find that framing very helpful of performing rather than connecting.
Mm-hmm.
So for people who are maybe curious about this or wondering, like, am I performing or am I connecting?
Mm-hmm.
How do we feel the difference?
Ooh, that's a big question, but
it's okay if there's not a clear answer.
I think that answer actually, I think everyone might have their own answer. I think the way that I would answer that question, just based off of my experience and sitting with people, would be, are you present? Are you present with yourself? Are you in touch with what your body is needing and wanting? Are you present with, if you are engaging with another human, are you present and connected with them? Are you openly communicating? Are you sharing the emotion behind what you're doing? Whether it doesn't always have to be this deep, intense, passionate, connecting. It can still be playful and fun and super erotic. But are you together playing and in the moment together? I think really is how I would start to ask that question of myself.
That's a great, I think, framework for people to start from. Thank you.
Yeah. Sex is hard. And
sex is hard.
Yeah. And it's great. And it's wonderful all at the same time.
Yeah. But it's just another part of being human, which is hard and confusing and changing all the time.
All the time.
Yeah. So we've defined compulsive sexual behavior, and we've mentioned attachment theory and kind of this rupture repair. Could you give us kind of an overview of when therapists talk about attachment theory, what are we talking about?
Yeah. And it is kind of all the rage right now. Attachment theory, and are you anxiously attached or avoidant? It's been around for quite a while. We just happen to have better science and research to really understand it, and to really see that our attachment starts the moment we're born. And it does shape and impact the structures of our brain and how they develop. And so what we're really talking about with attachment is our relationship with our caregivers. And the hope is that we develop a secure attachment, that we feel safe, loved. We can trust and rely on our caregivers to show up when we need them, that they're consistent, that they will repair if there is a rupture, that if they do hurt us, they're not going to leave us in that hurt all by ourselves. Unfortunately, most of us grow up with inconsistent attachment, and we find a lot of people with what we would call like an insecure attachment. We can divide that into an anxious attachment or an avoidant attachment. Anxious is just more of this feeling of like, kind of don't leave me. I'm scared to be by myself, but I'm also so scared to connect with you, but I'm going to find so many ways to try to connect with you. And then I would say the avoidant is, somebody who typically shuts down as a way to protect themselves. Like, oh, my caregiver isn't reliable. I can't depend on them. Okay, well, I'm just going to disconnect from my feelings then. And sometimes we have individuals that will kind of go between the two. And the interesting part about, some of the newer research on attachment is we used to think that attachment was really just something that we needed and had in childhood, but it really truly is what they say, cradle to grave. And we don't keep our attachment with our parents. We actually transfer that attachment to our romantic partners. And we, if we're not aware of it, we're not talking about it, that dance of insecure, anxious, avoidant attachment can get played out in those romantic relationships. And even, our attachment framework shapes the way that we view relationship with ourselves, as well as relationship with our friends, our romantic partners, our coworkers. So it really is, it is an important way to see how our brains shape who we are.
Yeah, it sort of becomes the template that we use to understand all of our other relationships.
That's a great word to use for that.
We kind of map it in there. And then when it doesn't fit, that can cause anxiety, which can lead us to act out in trying to please and fix that anxiety, or run away, that avoidance, or some combination of the two.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So how does attachment theory, if we pull this into compulsive sexual behavior within the context of intimate relationships, how can we understand sort of the impact of a betrayal like infidelity, and then also the potential for repair?
Yeah. Well, thinking about or remembering, we transfer that attachment need onto our romantic partners. If there is a betrayal, that betrayal then hits at the core of who we are and how we see ourselves in relationships, and the need for safety and trust and an emotional connection. And oftentimes, especially if we have that insecure attachment, this relational wound, this rupture from the betrayal can feel like, oh my gosh, it is validating my worst fear. See, I'm not safe. I can't trust you. I can't trust anybody. I'm not lovable. Yes, exactly. And so it ends up devastating this part of you that has believed, oh my gosh, I found this person who's going to make me feel safe and lovable. And this is wonderful. This is the thing I've been craving my whole life. And I finally found it in my partner. And it shatters that belief. And it creates this like, how do I understand the world around me? And so it really is devastating for a lot of individuals. I would add, though, something that I think a lot of people don't think about is with the compulsive sexual behavior, regardless of the romantic partner, which is important to think about and look at, when you are struggling with that compulsive sexual behavior, in some ways you are also shattering the trust that you have with yourself. And because there is this internal felt sense of, I know I don't want to be doing this, but I can't stop it. I am not a reliable person for myself. I'm not taking good care of myself. And so much of the kind of healing work is, how do I show up and be that safe, reliable, trustworthy, connected person to myself? And in some ways, it has to start there before you can then show up for your partner who you've now created this really significant rupture. It has to start there.
I think you really just described one of the foundational principles of like why we do therapy at all. It's like our relationship to ourself then shapes how we engage the whole world. And if we don't have a good relationship with ourselves, that's going to keep playing out in different contexts and in different ways.
Yes. Which can oftentimes feel really difficult for the betrayed partner, because the person struggling with the compulsive sexual behavior does have to do this individual work. And the betrayed partner's sitting over here saying, oh my gosh, but what about me? I'm hurting. Wait, what? You're getting kudos because you have 60 days sober? Oh, but what about me? I'm still hurting. And so then that's where the process of repair between the two becomes really important in terms of learning how to show up for that pain, for the person who did betray. How can you hold space for, your pain matters? I'm still struggling with how to show up for you consistently and safely, but I'm learning, I'm growing, I'm trying, and it really does matter. And creating, both partners have to create an openness and a willingness to essentially take a risk to say, okay, I'm going to let you in. I'm going to share this pain. I'm going to connect with you. And I hope that you're going to hold it well. And it is through that kind of repeated process of, okay, I'm going to give you a little bit more of my pain. What are you going to do with it? And then, okay, I'm going to hold your pain, and I'm not going to go into a shame spiral, and I'm still going to hold on to my worth. And together we can create this more secure attachment. And I will say this often when I'm working with couples in the beginning, and most of them will kind of scoff at me or laugh at me when I say, if you really stick to this work, and it is hard and it is really messy, but most people will say they end up being so grateful that this thing was discovered, because they end up with a relationship that is more connected and more secure than they ever could have imagined. And I've seen it happen, and I believe it in my whole being that is possible.
Yeah. In that, there is this foundational sort of requirement that is so hard of, when you are hurting and or in shame, still holding space for the experience of the other person, which is important here, but is important kind of in all forms of rupture in life. I'm thinking about kind of what's happening nationally as things are getting more and more separated, and people are more and more hurt by the other side. The idea of holding compassion and empathy for what the other side is going through becomes harder and harder. And so I imagine stepping into that space, going to therapy after a rupture like that feels so deep and so to the core, and then saying, okay, now sit with that hurt and have empathy for the person who hurt you. It's a big ask.
It is a big ask. But I think that it brings us back to that idea of, if we learned, and most of us didn't, if we had learned growing up that it was okay to make a mistake, that I am still lovable even when I am imperfect, it would be easier to hold that shame. But most of us didn't. And so there is this belief oftentimes, and I didn't kind of label this, Patrick Carnes did. One of the core beliefs is, if you really knew me, if you knew my deepest, darkest secrets, you would not love me. And that is where, the compassion is such a key ingredient to helping us stay connected and to heal, to be able to say, oh my gosh, you see all of me and you didn't run out of the room. That's where I think the hope is. Okay, yeah, we might disagree on things, or yes, you've deeply hurt me, but at the end of the day, if I can have compassion for you, it also means that I can have compassion for myself, because I also am imperfect and have hurt people.
I'm curious for you, because I can see where that mentality and that expectation might unfairly burden the victim of the wounding.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you sort of explore with people how to make sure both parties are open to coming to the table?
That's a fair question. This doesn't happen overnight. And so we might have to spend many weeks, maybe even months, helping the, kind of the offending partner, the person who is struggling with the compulsive sexual behavior, sit with and just hear the pain before the betrayed partner has the space to recognize, okay, my partner didn't do this to hurt me. My partner is also a wounded individual who has a history, who has been doing this out of their own suffering. But that can take a long time for a partner to really get there. And so that is then where the individual work happens, of helping the person with the compulsive behavior sit in and manage their own shame until their partner is ready.
Yeah. I feel like this work is not for the faint of heart.
It is not. I often tell people, and kind of the standard phrase that we tell people when they're first coming in after this has been discovered, is early recovery, early kind of work in this area is 3 to 5 years. And that is just the time it takes to kind of unpack all of this, get stabilized. Then we can move into, well, what does this look like long term? How do we sustain this growth and the changes that we've made? But that's 3 to 5 years.
I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is sort of rewiring the nervous system of
Absolutely.
how we connect to other people is very much hardwired into our physical nervous system. And nerves take a long time to change.
They do. They do. And that is the one ingredient that we cannot change, is the time. We cannot speed it up.
You can't fast forward the hard parts?
No, and I wish we could.
Oh, life would be very different if we could. Yeah.
Yeah, it really would.
Yeah. In your experience working with people through, I mean, it's very intense work. What helps people grow the most from their missteps, or for the sake of the podcast, let's call them failures, especially when those failures happen within these relationships? Like, what's the ingredients for growth?
Yeah. I think it has to start with self-compassion. And oftentimes I know that is, for a lot of my clients, that is one of the more difficult components. But recognizing that we are human and none of us have this thing called life figured out. Most of us are carrying wounds and burdens that we never speak of. And until we can have a softness and a tenderness towards that, I think the work is going to be really difficult. And so I think it has to start with that self-compassion. And then I think, it has to really, there has to be a willingness to get messy, because we're not going to get it right the first time. We're going to try to repair, and we're going to try to say all the right things to be attuned to our partner and to sit with their pain. But in the midst of that, we're human, and I might get defensive, or I might get triggered. And so it's going to be messy. But can we keep showing up and hope that over time we're going to get better little by little. And as long as both people are willing to do that, I think there's hope. When we aren't, I don't know that there's really room to grow. And so those are really the key ingredients that I see. Everything else in between, those kind of things, every person is different. They might need different things, but those two ingredients are really necessary for everybody.
So the self-compassion and the willingness to show up.
Yes.
Thinking about this in preparation for our talk, and just thinking about how, not everyone has that willingness, and there can be that point of just like, I can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the wrong choice. It's just sometimes we can't do it.
Absolutely. You know what? I think I want to add too, maybe one other ingredient, honesty, because you're absolutely right. Sometimes for whatever reason, we can't show up with that willingness, and also we get to choose that. And everyone is entitled to their choice, but can we be honest about it? So if I'm in a partnership and I am no longer willing to grow and to work on getting better at repair and connection, I owe my partner, I owe my friends, I owe my coworkers the honesty of saying, I can't do that. And then they get to make their own decision based on my truth. So I would add that ingredient as well. And I've had partners, I've had my own experiences where, somebody has said, I can't give this to you. And then I got to decide, what am I going to do with that?
Mm-hmm.
And it's painful, but at the end of the day, it is freedom.
Yeah, it's freedom. And there's when we can't have that honesty, I see people sometimes blowing up relationships in different ways. Mm-hmm. Either self-sabotage or kind of attacking the other person so that they end it in these different ways. And ultimately, that's a form of avoidance, of not dealing with what's actually going on.
Yeah, it is. When really, if we had the ego strength and the awareness of, even if I disappoint this person, I am still going to be okay. And I trust that this other grown-up can manage their disappointment. If we can believe that, then we can be honest. But so often we don't know that. We are afraid of disappointing others. And you're right. We find these other unique ways because our brains and our bodies are going to find a way to manage the thing that needs to be managed.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes blowing things up or kind of instigating certain types of fights that then lead to a breakup, it's our way of trying to make something very complicated black and white. Mm-hmm. And then we can walk away and say, they were the bad person, I was the good person. Or for some people, it's they were the good person, I was the bad person. This fits with how bad I see myself as. Mm-hmm. And it removes the struggle of like, we're all good, we're all bad. We have to navigate that, like, sometimes even our best efforts are, in our goodness, we are going to disappoint and hurt other people.
Yes.
That's a hard reality.
Yeah.
But so much of your work is then kind of bringing people into the gray area and how do we exist here and do this together?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's making me think of a silly example of, why, going back to our early attachment, why that becomes so important in all of this work. I think about a little kid that spills a glass of milk. They're a little kid. They're being rambunctious. They're doing what kids do. And they spill a glass of milk. The caregiver has an option. How do we respond? I would say most people I work with, the typical response is, I can't believe you did that. Pay attention. Stop misbehaving.
Stop making my life harder.
Yes. And so they start to learn that I am inherently bad if I make a mistake. I think we need to change that narrative. No, you made a mistake. You're doing what kids do. Okay, let's clean up the milk.
Let's clean it up together.
Yes.
Start
You're
teaching
not alone.
responsibility, but also you're not alone.
Yeah. And you're not bad because a mistake, a failure happened.
That sort of cracks something open, because most kids, when they do something like that, they will kind of freeze and look at the caregiver like, am I in trouble? And I think some people who maybe had punitive upbringings will swing the other way to say, no, it's okay, I'll take care of it. You go play. And that removes kind of the learning of, when we make mistakes, we have to clean them up.
Yeah. Yes. And then take that into what that might look like as an adult. Oh, I'm at work and I made a mistake on that email or that contract. Oh my gosh, what is my boss thinking? And are they going to let me go? Am I going to get am I going to get written up? Am I in trouble? And this aching, I'm constantly in trouble if I am not perfect at this job, is exhausting for people.
And similar to our fears as a child, because if my caregiver doesn't like me and doesn't look out for me, how will I live? Pleasing your boss is, well, if I get fired, how do I live? Like, I need income to survive.
Yes. Yeah. And then bring it back to our romantic relationships. Because we are biologically hardwired to be in community, to be connected. If I make a mistake and you leave me, that in our primitive parts of us, that could equal death.
How do I access food if I don't have my community?
Yes.
How do I stay warm at night?
And so then we're constantly in this state of, I have to hide my imperfections.
I have to appear perfect in order to survive.
Yeah.
And I want to acknowledge that for some communities, that rings truer than for others, like minoritized identities, is there's a heightened risk of imperfection. Quite literally, you might be at a higher threat level when you make mistakes. Yes.
And not only that, you have to, in some ways, I would say, you have to prove your perfectness, if that's a way to say it, more than other groups in order to stay in the community. And so it puts an exponential burden on that population.
Oof, that is heavy. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked kind of about what the ruptures look like, what the repair looks like, and showing up and doing the work and having... I appreciate that you gave a time frame to it, because so often when we are sitting in discomfort, we want it over. And it's like, okay, well, I can give 2 months to this. But when we're thinking in the longer term, that's part of informed consent in what we do, right? If you're signing up for treatment, what does this look like? And how do we check in to see if we can still keep doing it? If circumstances in our life change, which happens, of like, I'm invested in this, you know what? I actually can't do this anymore. And that's the honesty piece you were pulling in.
Yeah. And sometimes that happens.
It takes a lot of courage to show up, to be vulnerable, to have self-compassion, to be honest. So this is something that people don't feel courageous while they're doing it because it's so raw. But that raw, that vulnerable is one of the more courageous ways to engage life.
Yeah. Yes. And I think that's where the healing is, in that courage.
Okay. Any other thoughts you have before we kind of move into how my final question for everybody?
I think we covered a lot.
We did cover a lot.
Yeah.
So then if you feel comfortable, I acknowledge that all therapists have different comfort levels. Would you be open to sharing an example of your own growth through failure?
Yeah. I actually really love this question. Through the years, I've gotten, I think, more comfortable disclosing, parts of my story. And I don't know if taking pride in it is the right way to describe it, but maybe appreciating it is the right way to describe it. But, you know, if you had asked me 10 years ago what I thought about being imperfect or making mistakes, I would have said I was still terrified of them. I was still very much operating out of this, I have to play a part in the world, and if I'm not doing it well, I'm going to lose all the things that matter to me.
Mm.
And then it happened. I ended up discovering, and I was in the middle of grad school when this happened, discovering that the person that I was married to at the time was struggling with compulsive sexual behavior and other compulsive addictions and behaviors as well. And I thought to myself, what am I doing here? I'm trying to help other people, other couples, and my own marriage is blowing up. And then when it didn't work, and he decided not to do the work or be willing to get the help, I felt like a failure. And especially growing up in a religious home where divorce was really kind of shunned and looked at as a failure. I mean, literally spoken about as a failure. I really thought I was not going to survive. But then I did. And I realized that I wasn't the only one who felt that way. But at the time I felt completely alone. I felt like, oh my gosh, everyone else has this thing called life figured out except me. And then I found out none of us have it figured out. And the people that say they do are kind of just pretending.
Or really, really full of themselves.
Yes. And, kind of, it was so painful at the time. But one thing that I reflect back on is, that my ex was able to be honest with his choice and his limitations. Now I see it as a gift. At the time, I thought it was, oh, it must be because I'm not lovable. I'm not worth it. But his honesty was, he was sharing his truth with me. And then I had to decide, well, what am I going to do with it? And yeah, I was in pain for a while, but then I decided, you know what? Give me every book, every podcast, every lecture I can get my hands onto. Let me connect with other people who are going through this, and let me figure it out. And let me figure out how did I end up here? I chose my ex for a reason. And although I didn't choose his compulsive behavior, I had a part in that relationship, and I had to really look at what parts of me needed tending to. How can I grow? And I'm so glad I did, because now I have a practice. I have a partner that I love, that I feel inspired by, and I feel hope for. And I know that there is healing, even when it doesn't feel like it. We're planting seeds, and we're continually growing if we choose that. And it can be really beautiful, especially when we do it with other people.
Yeah. I'm really struck by how your partner wasn't able to engage, but you still took the opportunity to show up with the openness and to the learning and the compassion for that community. So maybe he couldn't show up in that way, but you learned to understand compulsive sexual behavior from a place of compassion, rather than disregarding all of those people and saying, because there can be a desire to say, like, I'm done with quote unquote these people, whatever that category is. But then to step in to say, I want to understand, I want to learn, I want to be compassionate. And then look at what you've been able to help people with by taking that risk and that vulnerability.
Yes, but I have to admit something here. That was not an easy process. And the universe had a gift for me, because prior to actually working with people who struggled with compulsive sexual behavior, I had only worked with betrayed partners, and I felt really comfortable and confident in that. And then I signed up and applied for and got accepted to the internship at the residential treatment. And I actually was terrified. I was so afraid. Oh my gosh, am I going to hate these people? Am I going to be angry with them? And the very first person that I was kind of fully in charge of as an intern ended up being this older gentleman, a pastor, who, if you didn't know his story, you would say, "Oh my gosh, I want him to adopt me. He's such a great guy. He would be such a great dad," and he was. And yet he had this whole hidden life, and really, when it got discovered, it blew everything up for him. But as I sat with him and learned his story, we really uncovered that his compulsive sexual behavior was a reenactment of his childhood sexual abuse. And it gave me so much compassion for, wow, somebody doesn't choose this. Underneath this, there is pain, and we all have pain. And I have yet to find a way to measure pain, because pain is pain.
And there's a certain subjective nature to it.
Yes. And so when I really sat with, oh my gosh, he's hurting just like I'm hurting, it changed the way that I view all of this. And also I saw that he had that willingness to, okay, this is scary. I'm terrified. I want to die because this has gotten discovered, but I'm going to choose to live and to grow. And he did. And it transformed his marriage and his relationship with his kids. I was blown away. It inspired me.
To be inspired by the community that hurt you and you were scared of.
Yes.
That took a lot of courage to do what you did.
Yeah. And as you said that, I think, gosh, could we take a lesson from that just in today's world?
I hope so.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
I think we need it.
And it's a helpful reminder of, when we tell our stories looking back on how we grew through failure, it's so easy to kind of see the end point. And then when we hear the end point, it's like, well, I just want to get there. And this goes back to what you were saying of like, it takes time. 3 to 5 years to change something so ingrained and drastic and deep within us.
Yes. It takes time, and also there truly is no final destination. There are just layers of growth and awareness and self-compassion and compassion for others. It evolves. We don't ever arrive at something.
Yeah, I don't think we ever arrive at anything.
Yeah.
Maybe eventually death. We arrive at death.
Yeah, that is fair. Yes. We all will get there.
Yeah. But our journey along the way is defined by either staying in these repetitive patterns or finding ways to evolve. And I think those ingredients you gave us are good, not just for the compulsive sexual community, but for all of us, of how do we show up with self-compassion, with a willingness and an openness to learn and to make mistakes. I'm sure your journey was very messy. And there's a certain sort of delicacy or fragileness to our messiness that makes those things only we share with people we deeply trust. But the broad arc of things is sort of like, this is what I went through. And it gives us hope for other people. So thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with any words of encouragement you might have for people who are in the middle of the messiness right now.
Keep going. Don't give up on yourself. And practice getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, practice getting comfortable making mistakes and being okay with it.
Love it. If people would like to learn more about you, connect with you, work with you, where might they find you?
They can find me on Psychology Today, and reach out from the information provided there.
Perfect. Dr. Clinkenbeard, thank you so much for joining me today, for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, your history. This was a really rich and enlightening discussion. And thank you to everyone who listened today. Remember that failure is a necessary part of growth, so keep failing, keep learning, keep growing. Special thank you to everyone who contributed to this project. Consulting producer and editor, July Diaz. Producer and graphic designer, Ben Castle. Logo art by Josie Huang. Theme music by Daniel Rogers.